Abraham Lincoln was not born into greatness, and he did not grow into it easily. There was no moment in his early life where anyone could have looked at him and said, "This boy will one day carry the weight of a nation." He was born in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky, a place so simple and unforgiving that survival itself felt like a daily achievement. The floor was dirt, the walls let the cold in freely, and food was never guaranteed. His parents were poor farmers, not because they lacked effort, but because the land gave little in return. From the beginning, Abraham learned that comfort was not promised, and that life demanded endurance before it offered meaning. Even as a child, he understood hunger, not as a temporary inconvenience, but as a familiar presence that returned often. There were nights when the wind howled through the cabin, and mornings when the cold seemed to settle deep into his bones, and yet this was simply normal life. There were no complaints because there was no alternative. School was not a regular part of his childhood. Education was something that happened in fragments, borrowed moments when work allowed it. And what little he learned came not from classrooms, but from books, passed from hand to hand, their pages worn thin by previous readers who also sought something more. Abraham read slowly, carefully, as if each word mattered, and in time, books became more than knowledge. They became a quiet place where the world made sense. But childhood, already shaped by hardship, became something far heavier when his mother fell ill. There were no doctors, no medicine, no understanding of what was happening. The family waited, helpless, watching her grow weaker until one day she was gone. Abraham was 9 years old. The loss did not come with screaming or dramatic scenes. It came with a silence, the kind of silence that changes a child forever. Those who knew him later in life said that something shifted inside him that year. The boy who had already learned endurance now learned sorrow, and that sorrow did not fade with time. It settled in quietly and stayed. As Abraham grew older, people noticed that he was different. He was tall, awkward, often lost in thought. He did not speak quickly or easily, and when others joked or laughed, he often stood apart, observing rather than joining in. Some thought him strange, others thought him slow, but those who paid attention could see that his mind was always working. He asked questions that did not have easy answers: why people suffered, why injustice existed, why some lives seemed full of opportunity while others were defined by loss. These were not questions a farm boy was expected to ask, but Abraham asked them anyway, and he did not ask them once. He carried them with him. His sadness deepened as he aged, turning into something heavier than occasional grief. There were periods when he struggled so deeply that friends feared for his safety. Today, we would recognize this as depression, but in his time it was endured quietly, without language or treatment. Abraham lived with a mind that never fully rested, and yet even in his darkest moments, he refused to abandon curiosity. He believed that pain did not make life meaningless. Instead, it made understanding more urgent. He once said that he felt as though he was the most miserable man alive, and yet he woke each day and continued forward. That pattern defined his life. He moved not because he felt strong, but because stopping felt worse. As he entered adulthood, his struggles did not ease. They multiplied. Abraham tried his hand at business and failed completely, losing everything he had. He ran for political office and lost, again and again. Each rejection came publicly, leaving him exposed, embarrassed, and discouraged. Friends urged him to stop trying, to accept a smaller life, to spare himself further humiliation. But Abraham believed something deeply unsettling and deeply powerful. He believed that failure was not a final judgment. It was information. Each loss taught him something about himself and about the world. He once wrote that his greatest concern was not whether someone had failed, but whether they were content with that failure, and he was never content. At an age when most men settled into routine and certainty, Abraham was still searching, still questioning, still losing. Love did not offer him refuge either. He loved deeply, and that depth came with devastating loss. The woman he loved most, Anne Rutledge, died suddenly, and the grief nearly destroyed him. Those close to him feared he would not survive it. Later, relationships were estranged by his inner turmoil, by the sadness he carried so openly and yet could never fully explain. Even in moments of joy, something heavy lingered beneath the surface, and still he kept moving forward, not because he believed happiness was guaranteed, but because he believed responsibility mattered more than comfort. By the time Abraham Lincoln reached his early 50s, his life looked, by most standards, like a long list of missed chances and quiet disappointments. He had no wealth, no great reputation, no assurance that his efforts had meaning, and yet in 1861, against all expectations, he was elected President of the United States. It was not a victory that came with celebration. The nation was already breaking apart. States were leaving the Union. Families were divided. Hatred filled the air. Civil war was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. Lincoln did not enter the presidency with confidence or pride. He entered it with fear and a deep sense of obligation. He knew the responsibility he was accepting, and he knew the cost would be high. Almost immediately, the weight became unbearable. Every decision led to death. Every choice carried consequences he could not escape. He read letters from grieving mothers, visited hospitals filled with wounded soldiers, and listened as generals argued and politicians demanded. At night, he walked the White House halls alone, thinking, questioning, doubting. Leadership, he discovered, was not about commanding others. It was about carrying consequences that could never be shared. As the war dragged on, slavery haunted his conscience. He knew that ending it would inflame hatred and deepen division, but he also knew that compromise on this issue would rot the soul of the nation. When he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, it was not a political victory. It was a moral burden. He did not celebrate. He understood the danger. He understood that he had drawn a line that could not be erased. Threats followed. Isolation deepened. He was criticized from all sides. And yet, he held firm, believing that some decisions must be made not because they are popular, but because they are right. The war neared its end in the spring of 1865. The nation was exhausted, and so was Abraham Lincoln. For the first time in years, he allowed himself a moment of rest, attending a play at Ford's Theater. It was a small escape, a brief pause in a life defined by burden. He never returned home. A single gunshot ended his life, and as he lay dying, the weight he had carried finally lifted. The man who had held everyone else together was allowed to rest. Lincoln did not live to see a healed America, but he left behind something more enduring than victory. He left a lesson that leadership is not loud, that strength can exist alongside sorrow, that doing what is right often feels lonely. He once said, that he was not bound to win, but bound to be true, and in that truth he remains, held in time, not because he was flawless, but because he endured, because he stayed when leaving would have been easier, because he carried pain instead of passing it on. His life reminds us that history is not shaped by the confident, but by the committed, and that sometimes the quietest endurance leaves the deepest mark. And yet, even after his death, Abraham Lincoln's story did not end, because stories like his never truly do. They linger in quiet ways, in the spaces between a triumph and regret, in the moments when ordinary people are asked to choose between ease and responsibility. In the days following his assassination, the nation did not celebrate victory. It mourned. Streets fell silent, church bells rang endlessly, and people who had never met Lincoln wept openly. Many realized only then how deeply his presence had shaped their sense of stability. The man who had seemed burdened, distant, even melancholic in life, had become a symbol of endurance in death. But to understand why his story still matters, one must look not at the monument, but at the pattern of his life. Lincoln never sought admiration. He sought resolution. He believed that a nation, like a person, could not outrun its moral debts forever. Throughout his presidency, he carried the weight of contradiction, leading a country founded on liberty while confronting the reality of bondage, defending unity while presiding over division, speaking of peace while authorizing war. These contradictions did not confuse him. They defined him. He understood that progress is rarely clean or comfortable, and that meaningful change often requires walking directly through discomfort rather than around it. Those closest to him noticed how deeply these tensions affected him. He slept little. He ate irregularly. He aged visibly, his face growing more lined, his posture heavier, as though gravity itself pressed harder on him than on others. And yet, he retained a quiet gentleness. He told stories, often humorous, not to entertain, but to ease tension and remind others of their shared humanity. He believed laughter could momentarily soften even the hardest truths. In private moments, however, Lincoln remained deeply introspective. He questioned himself constantly, replaying decisions in his mind, wondering whether different paths might have spared lives. Unlike leaders who hide behind certainty, Lincoln lived openly with doubt. He believed doubt was not weakness, but honesty. As the war ended and the nation stood on the edge of reconstruction, Lincoln spoke not of punishment, but of healing. He urged forgiveness, not because wrongdoing should be forgotten, but because endless retribution would only deepen wounds. His vision for America was not one of triumph over enemies, but reconciliation among citizens. It was a vision rooted not in politics, but in moral imagination. His assassination cut that vision short, leaving a nation to navigate grief and anger without the man who had guided it through its darkest hours. In the years that followed, Lincoln's words gained new life. His speeches, once controversial, became touchstones. His insistence that a nation could not survive half free and half enslaved echoed far beyond his time. His belief that government existed to serve people rather than dominate them became a standard by which future leaders were measured. Yet perhaps Lincoln's greatest legacy lies not in policy or proclamation, but in example. He showed that leadership does not require invulnerability, that one can lead while wounded, decide while uncertain, and stand firm while internally breaking. He demonstrated that moral courage is often quieter than physical bravery and far lonelier. His life reminds us that greatness is rarely a sudden transformation. It is the accumulation of small, difficult choices made consistently over time. Lincoln did not become who he was because he overcame sadness. He became who he was because he carried it without letting it harden him. He allowed pain to deepen his empathy rather than narrow it. In doing so, he offered a model of a strength that feels especially rare in any era, a strength rooted in restraint, reflection, and responsibility. Even today, when the world feels divided and uncertain, Lincoln's story speaks with quiet clarity. It tells us that progress is fragile, that unity requires effort, and that the cost of doing what is right is often paid in a solitude. It reminds us that leadership is not about a certainty, but about commitment, not about popularity, but about conscience. Abraham Lincoln was not held in time because he won every battle. He was held in time because he stayed present in the hardest moments, because he chose principle over comfort, and because he accepted the burden of responsibility when walking away would have been easier. His story asks something of us still. It asks whether we are willing to endure discomfort in service of something larger than ourselves, whether we can remain gentle without becoming passive, and whether we can hold our doubts without surrendering to them. In remembering Lincoln, we are not simply honoring the past. We are being quietly challenged in the present, challenged to consider what it means to lead in our own lives, to choose integrity when it is inconvenient, and to remain committed even when recognition never comes. Some lives echo loudly through history, others remain steady, constant, and unyielding. Abraham Lincoln's life did not shout, it endured. And in that endurance, it continues to speak, reminding us that time does not hold those who are perfect, but those who are faithful to their conscience, even when the cost is heavy, even when the road is long, and even when the ending cannot be seen.